Anyways, okay, so we're going to talk about 5, 6, 2 conics. Circles is our topic today. So we already covered our standard form of a circle yesterday. You did a little bit of work with that. Again, we'll cover homework at the end. But now we're going to cover the general form and how we get out of this ugly form. Okay, so we don't like this form, how to get out of this. But this is the general form for the equation of a circle. There's not a specific form in this case, but essentially what you're going to notice here is that there's an x squared term, an x term, a y squared term, a y term, and some other numbers involved. Okay, and that's it. Just it doesn't look nice, but we can put it into a nice form. Okay, so we can't immediately determine the center and the radius looking at this. Our goal is to rewrite it into standard form, and the how to that is you complete the square. Okay, so this is, it's probably been a while, but I'm going to teach you guys completing the square again here. And go through that. But the standard today is to complete the square to find the center and the radius of a circle given by an equation. Okay, so a little bit of algebra here today, but to find our circle centers. And I've given you all of the steps on there. So how to complete the square. First of all, you need to understand what perfect squares are. So when it says complete the square, you want to complete a square term. Okay? Understanding perfect squares. If you look at something like this, x plus 3 squared is represented by x plus 3 times x plus 3. Okay, it's the same thing times itself. And that is equal to x squared plus 6x plus 9. What you know how to do is you know how to factor this right here, okay, and get back to this right here. And then hopefully you know if you see x plus 3 times x plus 3, you can write it as x plus 3 squared. Okay, so that's really all we're doing. But the question is, how do I complete this and make it a square term? Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to find this number right here. Okay, the linear coefficient b is double the initial value. The constant term c, so this is b, is double the initial value. The constant term c is the initial value squared. Okay, and the relationship between b and c is what's here. So what's going to come down to this is you are going to be given something like x squared and 6x, and I'm going to say complete the square. Okay, what that means is you need to find this number. The way that you find that number is right here. Okay, so if I'm highlighting something, I'm going to highlight this right here because we need to know how to complete the square. So you would take, if that was my example, I would take the 6 that's my b. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 3 squared is 9. And it's as simple as that to find your completed square. Okay, you take your b value divided by 2 and square it, and that's the number that you fill into that box. Okay, so this is, we haven't even talked about the circle part of it yet. We're just looking at completing the square. So we're going to do some practice with that. So if you look at this, follow that formula. Again, you're using that idea. We're trying to find the c value in these, and we're using the idea that it's b divided by 2 squared. I really want to catch up, we'll see. But it's b divided by 2 squared as we go through this. So on that first one, we're going to pause, that's okay. On this one right here, you do 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 squared is 16. And that's your answer. I would write it if I could, but I can't. So. Go ahead and do your next view and see if you can get it. So for b, you do negative 2 divided by 2, and that quantity squared. Okay? Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 squared, anytime that you square a negative number, it's going to come positive. So negative 1 squared is positive 1, and that becomes 1. So I'm not going to be right up there. Okay, so we get 1. Okay, what happens if you have an odd number? Well, it doesn't divide nicely by 2. Okay? So there's a few options. Yes, you can use decimals. I don't suggest it because it's going to be a little bit easier to look at the non-decimal numbers, but you can. Okay, so 5 divided by 2, those don't divide. So then I just square them. And if you're going to square a fraction, you square the top and you square the bottom. And so in this case, you would get 25 over 4. Okay, you can write it as a decimal if you want to. I just don't necessarily suggest that as you're going through these. So that's how to find forming your perfect square, how to complete the square. Okay. Then if you have that completed square, how do you write or how do you factor it out? Okay, it's going to be basic factoring. All of our factoring is going to involve a 1 in the front. So you don't have to worry about any of that. It's just as simple as what adds to 6 and multiplies to 9. Okay? And it's 3 in this case, right? And it's based on what we're doing, it's always going to be the same number. Okay? Which also means it's always going to be the square root of this number here. Okay? To multiply to the same thing, it's always going to be the square root of this number. So, in this case, it's going to be x plus 3 times x plus 3. The second one, what's it going to be? Good, x minus 1 squared in this case. So it would factor into x minus 1. So you're looking at this and you're like, okay, square root of 1 is 1. But you have to go back and look at this minus 2. And to get that, you have to make them negative. Okay? So x minus 1 times x minus 1. What Esma just said there is essentially that this x plus 3 times x plus 3, I can write it as x plus 3 squared. And we're going to want to do that. This x minus 1 times x minus 1, I can write as x minus 1 maybe squared. Okay? So what do I get here when you have that fraction? What do you get? What am I going to write here? Yeah.
I got x minus 7 over 2.
Good.
And then squared.
Good.
Yeah.
And you can write it twice or you can write it squared. Okay? But this is exactly right. This is to most of you x minus 3.5. It's the same thing. So it's just to understand that it doesn't have to be a whole number. I leave them as fractions because taking the square root of 49 over 4 is a lot easier than taking the square root of whatever you get there, 12.25, okay? So it's just easier to take those square roots and find these numbers. Okay, so that's how we get to our squares. Now this should kind of look at this and say, okay, I know where this is going with circles, because that's what was in our circle equation, is we want to get to that point. Okay. Fun. Okay, so how to complete the square? Incorporating it into an actual equation. Okay, so when you're going to complete the square in an equation and figure this out, what you're looking at here is that x squared plus 2x minus 33 is not something we can factor. There's not something that multiplies to negative 33 and adds to 2. Okay, so when we want to complete the square, we want to, I just want to make sure I'm following all my steps correctly. Yeah. We want to add our 33 to the other side. We want to get it out of the way, because we're going to complete the square with this x squared and this 2x. So we want to get this 33 out of the way, so I'm going to move it to the other side, and I can do that by adding. Okay, so it's going to be equal to 33. X squared plus 2x equal to 33. And then what we've been doing to complete the square, if we go back to these ideas here, is that we've been adding on some random number, and we can find that through this formula. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here, is we're going to add on some random number. Now, in an equation, if I add something to one side, I have to add it to the other. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up x squared plus 2x plus blank, I'll find that number in a second, equal to 33 plus blank. If you add it to one side of the equation, you have to add it to the other to keep it as an equation. Okay, so that's what we're doing, is we're adding it to both sides. What's filling in that blank? 1, why? What'd you do?
The 2 over 2 is 1 squared.
Good. You're taking this number right here, that 2, divided by 2, and that quantity squared. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, 1 squared is 1. So we're putting a 1 in each of those blanks. Now if you look at x squared plus 2x plus 1, that is something that we know how to factor. Okay? 1 times 1 makes 1, and 1 plus 1 makes 2. So that's how we know how to factor it. And I factor this to say x plus 1 squared. Okay, you can write it as x plus 1 times x plus 1, but eventually you're going to want to write it as squared. Is equal to, and then I just add these together, and I get that it's equal to 34. Now, I did say solve the following by completing the square. If you look at this, we can't factor it, and so you're like, oh, I can't solve it or whatever. Okay, if we get to here, notice there's an x. To solve this, I could take a square root of both sides, and I could subtract 1. Okay, now I'm going to tell you that the rest of this is not important, okay, so we could keep going through this and go from there. We're going to stop at this step right here in solving, because that gives us our really nice little parentheses squared that we need for our circle equations. Okay, so yes, the directions say solve, okay, but I'm telling you right now, and that's why we're doing it in a class, that yes, you could keep going, but we don't need that information, so I'm going to stop here. Okay, if I do this one, I want to complete the square with this x squared and this x. Essentially, I want to have to rewrite my x terms into one term just like I did down here. Okay? So to do that, I look at it and I say, okay, do I know two things that multiply to 36 and add to negative 20? It's not going to complete a square that way, okay? So I'm going to get rid of that 36, get it to the other side. So I'm going to have x squared minus 20x. I'm going to put my plus blank here, instead of rewriting it, equal to, I subtracted 36 to both sides. Make sure you don't add it, okay? So I get a negative 32, and then don't forget your plus blank, okay? You don't have to do the blank thing. I find that you will make fewer mistakes if you do it, just so you don't forget it on the other side. Okay? You do not have to do it. That's just kind of my tool to use. So I've got those plus blanks in here. I ignore this negative 32. I'm completing the square over here. Okay? B divided by 2 squared. You have to memorize that little thing there, that little formula. Okay? So it's negative 20 divided by 2, and that quantity squared. So negative 20 divided by 2 is negative 10. Negative 10 squared is 100. So I'm going to add 100 onto each of these. It's a positive number. So why did I put plus? Because every one of them is going to be a positive number. If you type in your calculator negative 10 squared, it's going to tell you negative 100. You have to have the parentheses. So I'm putting these parentheses in there required. Okay, make sure that you do that. Okay, what's x squared minus 20x plus 100? What's the factorization there? What's it going to make? I want something squared. Find it. What is it? Jake, you got it? You know how to find it? Yeah?
Is it x minus 10?
It is x minus 10. How do you figure it out, Amanda? How do you know it's minus 10?
Because there's a negative 20x, so like you have to have a negative 10.
Good. So you've got negative 20. You need two numbers that are exactly the same that I add to this. Divided by 2. Okay? Notice whatever number is in here is what we're going to put down here. Negative 20 divided by 2 is negative 10, right? Okay? 2 divided by 2 is positive 1. Okay? Whatever number is inside those parentheses is the number that's going in here. If that helps you, use it. Okay? It's also the square root of this, except then you have to pay attention, is it negative positive? Which he was mentioning there, you've got the negative. Okay? Then add these together. So 100 minus 32. Good. Okay? We get our 68 there. And again, I could keep going. I'm not going to do that because there's no reason to get to those extra steps right now, and this is what we need to get to. Okay? So we're there. Solve by completing the square. We need to know how to do that. Then we got to put it all together. Okay, so here's our first example. Write the following equation in standard form to determine the center and the radius of this circle. So this is a circle. How do I recognize that it's a circle? Because it has an x squared, an x, a y squared, a y term, and it doesn't necessarily have to have all of those, but it has those different terms in it. As long as you have an x squared and a y squared, you've got a conic. Okay, the question is which kind of conic do you have? We're going to get into the other ones later and you'll kind of see. But this is going to be a circle. It doesn't necessarily all have to be on the same side of the equation. Some of it could be on the other side. There's all kinds of things that can happen here. But we want to complete the square, so I tried to set this one up fairly simply. Okay? What you are going to do in completing the square is you are going to essentially complete the square twice to rewrite this. So I'm going to complete the square with the x squared plus the 14x. Okay, plus blank. There's where I'm completing the square there. I'm going to change colors here. Plus I'm going to do y squared. Oh, I did it wrong. Anybody catch that? 14x and 8x go together, right? It would help if I put them together. So let's go back to that. Should be x squared, put the 14x and the 8x together. Okay, so plus 6x plus blank. And then we go over to the plus y squared, which doesn't have anything else. Now here's the really nice thing. When you have nothing else with the y squared, it's just y. If you want to write these extra steps, you can, because I'm just going to show you why it doesn't matter, but you don't necessarily have to. So if I'm completing the square with this, it's a 0y, and then plus blank. And then if I continue the problem is equal to, on this side I have this negative 1, and then I had a blank here and a blank here. Both of those need to be added to this side. Okay? Whatever you add to one side of an equation has to be added to the other side. So that's what I'm showing there. Treat it as two separate problems. Okay? The blue problem over here, what's going to fill in that blue blank? What is it? 9. We've been dealing with that one. 6 divided by 2 is 3. 3 squared is 9. Fill in a 9. As soon as I fill that in, I come over to the other side and I fill in a 9 so I don't forget. Okay? Do the red equation. B divided by 2 squared. What's going to fill in this blank? 0 is correct. Okay, so I told you that you don't actually have to do this. We'll talk about that in a second, but this is 0. Okay, 0 divided by 2 is 0. 0 squared is still 0. So we add 0 onto both sides. Okay. We still treat it as two separate problems. This blue problem is going to be written as what squared? X plus 3. Good. See, we're catching on. Got it? X plus 3 squared. This red problem is going to be written as what? It would be y plus 0. Now again, we're going to skip some steps in a little bit on something like this, but it's y plus 0 squared. There's a plus sign in the middle of these two, so we can put a plus sign in the middle of those two. Is equal to what? 8. Now, does that look more like a circle equation? So what's the center? Negative 3, 0, and what's the radius?
4.
No. Tricked you. Good, it's the square root of 8. Okay? So that's what I know. Now, what happened in here? We got this y plus 0, right? So technically, when we finish writing this, if it's asking us the equation, we should write just y squared equal to 8. So do you have to do all of these steps in here? The answer is no. Okay? If you only have a y squared, you don't have a y term, you can actually skip completing the square with it. And you can see here why, because if it's a 0y, it's just a 0. It's not changing anything about the problem. It's going to go back to a y squared. So you do not have to do those steps of completing the square there. Okay? So there's one example. We've got our center and our radius given to us. So here's another one. Write the following equation in standard form. See if you can write it out. Put your different pieces together. So you want your x squared term first. Then you want your x term. Then you want a blank. Then you want a y squared term. Your y term. And a blank. And then equal to, you want your number on the other side, your constant on the other side, plus a blank and a blank. So I'm going to write that up here if you didn't follow that. We're going to have x squared minus 6x plus a blank. Okay. And then we're going to do plus y squared minus 12y. Keep the symbols with what they are in front of. Okay, plus a blank. And then that's going to be equal to my negative 55 that was here. To move to the other side has to become a positive. I add it to the other side, so it's 55. Okay, and then it's going to be plus that green blank and plus that red blank that I have up there. Any questions on that step? Ask if you're not sure. Okay, then you complete the square. Okay, so we do it on the green problem first. We're doing negative 6, and some of you are going to want to write this step. Negative 6 divided by 2 quantity squared. So that's negative 3 squared. Negative 3 squared is 9. So I'm going to put a 9 there, and on the other side. Don't forget it on the other side. Okay. Y squared minus 12y plus blank. I'm going to do negative 12 divided by 2 and that quantity squared. So I'm going to get negative 6 squared, which is 36. Put your 36 on both blanks. Okay, factor your green one here. Okay, so x squared minus 6x plus 9 becomes x minus, because I had a minus in there. Remember, this negative 6 divided by 2, if you take the square part away, is your answer. So it's minus 3 squared plus, and then what I had in here was negative 6, so it's going to be y minus 6 squared is equal to, and then add your 55, your 9, and your 36 together. And you get 100 in this case. Okay. And remember, we're writing the following equations in standard form so that we can determine the center and the radius. So to answer the question, the center is what? 3, 6, good. And the radius is? There you go. Okay. So that's what you're doing with these kinds of problems. The only other piece is how to graph it. Okay. Really nothing more than what we've already learned. Okay, you have to put it in standard form to find your center and your radius and graph just like we did yesterday. So it's just an extra problem. Try it out. I'll give you a second to get ahead of me. See what you can do. Remember, you want your x squared term, your x term a blank, your y squared term, a y term a blank, equal to your constant plus a blank plus a blank. So you're going to have to move some things from side to side of this equation for this one. put on the board what you guys should end up with. Go ahead and take a look. Once you feel confident about it, move to the homework, and I'm here to answer questions on last night's homework too, okay? So work on the homework. I'm giving you plenty of time here today to get ahead on it, ask questions, know what you're doing before you leave today.